Afternoon. Give everybody a second here. Okay. Good afternoon again. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the ALDF LA Animal Law Symposium. My name's Tom Linney, and I'm the pro bono coordinator for ALDF. On this panel this afternoon, we're going to address CAFOS from a human protection perspective. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, a very distinguished group. First up will be Leslie Brueckner. She's a senior attorney at Public Justice. In 2011, she became the director of Public Justice's new Food Safety and Health Project, which seeks to hold corporations accountable for the manufacture, distribution, and marketing of food and other products that endanger consumer safety, health, and nutrition. In 2012, Leslie was honored by ALDF for our Advancement of Animal Law Pro Bono Achievement Award, so she has an extra special place in my heart. In addition to her litigation work, she's also taught appellate advocacy at American and Georgetown Law Schools. And let's see, pictured above, we thought we'd have some fun with this, and formatting's off, but some of her companion animals include Boris, Pushkin, Sputnik, and Dimitri. And Leslie doesn't know this, but Dimitri snuck into her luggage for this trip and is actually soaking up Los Angeles right now as we speak. What's that? No. I know you folks in LA appreciate a good Photoshop fail, so this is one. Okay. So our next panelist is Paige Tomaselli. She's a senior staff attorney at the Center for Food Safety, where she works on law and policy related to genetically engineered crops, organic standards, factory farming, and other food safety issues. She's a dedicated environmental advocate with a focus on animal welfare and food safety issues. She also co-wrote a chapter in the recently released CAFO reader, The Tragedy of Industrial Animal Factories, entitled Changing the Law, The Road to Reform. Pictured above is a picture of Paige and Tweak, who she lost recently. Tweak is beautiful. But unlike Carter Dillard, who Tweak's legacy I want to see live on, so I thought I'd do a... Sorry, Carter. Our third and final panelist is David Simon. Dave's a lawyer, advocate, and author of a great book called Meatonomics. He works as general counsel for a healthcare company and serves on the board of the APRL Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting animals. He received his JD from the University of Southern California. No yelling? Okay. And he's also the author of New Millennium Law Dictionary, a full-length legal dictionary. And pictured above is Dave and his rescue bunny, Cosmo. And while Dave is with us today, Cosmo actually went where all bunnies go when they come to Los Angeles. So please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Leslie Brueckner.
Oh, it's so good to have a good laugh. I have to tell you, I'm still shaking from this morning's amazing presentation on the animal effects of industrial animal agriculture. And today, I'm here to talk to you about the human health impacts of industrial animal agriculture. Let me see if this works. Actually, we can go back to the other one, it's fine. But how do I go forward? Oh, there we go. This is a Hieronymus Bosch painting of this weird creature with the whiskers eating a human, which I thought was karma in action, possibly. Before I start, I have an apology to make. When I got back to my seat after the first panelist, someone left me a note saying, please use immigrants, not aliens. I had made a reference to illegal aliens during one of my comments. And of course, what I should have said is undocumented immigrants. And, you know, it occurred to me that the term illegal aliens is a vestige from my youth. I grew up in San Diego, and that's what people talked about. That's how we called undocumented aliens. And it is, I started to think about how it's a way of dehumanizing people in order to feel better about taking away their rights or not granting them rights in the first place. And then I thought about how we've done that throughout human history. In the Rwandan genocide, for example, the people were taught to think of people, the Tutsi tribe, as cockroaches and so forth. And we saw that with the German approach to Jews in World War II and Jews throughout history. And it occurred to me that we also do that about animals now. And I was thinking about some of the terms that we use. So livestock, stock, it's like the stuff you have on your shelves. And even concentrated animal feeding operations is sort of an amazingly chilling euphemism for houses of animal torture. And then animal husbandry may be the ultimate. Animal husbandry, which I looked up, and it's defined as the management and care of farm animals. And it may have been the case 50 years ago, before the rise of massive industrial farming, that there was some modicum of truth to the term husbandry, but as we've learned this morning, the industry has really degenerated into an obscene culture of industrialized torture of animals on every level. So, on that note, my job is to give you an overview about what are the human health effects of the industrial animal sector. And I'm really talking about three things when you look at this. We're talking about CAFOS themselves, where the animals are raised and fed, and then also the processing plants, the slaughterhouses, and the poultry processing plants. And when you're looking at human health impacts, you really have to look at the whole ball of wax. Before I get into the details, I think it's important to consider, why do we even really care about the human health impacts? I mean, what we've heard this morning is reason enough. The ethical implications is reason enough why this industry should be, changed in fundamental ways, if not shut down. And from my perspective, the only way this industry is ever going to be reformed is if we can get consumers to stop buying the meat, because the monetary interests behind this are so powerful, and the government has proven so unwilling to take any serious action. So, in order to get consumers to buy meat, what do you have to do? The sad truth is that, from my perspective, the vast majority of the population either doesn't know about the animal welfare issues, doesn't want to know about the animal welfare issues, doesn't care about the animal welfare issues, or, in a lot of cases, they believe that the costs of industrial animal farming actually outweigh, the benefits of industrial animal agriculture actually outweigh the costs. And people, they like meat, they like a burger, they like a steak. And the meat industry spends millions and millions and millions of dollars perpetrating the myth that meat is good for you, that the animals are happy, et cetera. And unless that myth is dismantled, I don't think that it's realistic to think that we're going to make very serious inroads on this industry, at least in the short term. So let's start dismantling the myth. What are the facts about the human health impacts? The reality is that the industrial animal sector is catastrophic, and I use that term advisedly. It's catastrophic on all different levels, both in terms of toxic food, toxic workplaces, toxic communities, and the toxic world. I'm going to principally focus on the first two. Let's talk about toxic food. I divided this into two categories. One is just the food poisoning, the poisonous food that comes out of these places, just in terms of adulteration. And then the other broad character is animal drugs, the drugs that we put into animals to make them unable to endure the horrific conditions in CAFOS, and what impacts do those drugs have on humans. So the Johns Hopkins Institute wrote this in 2008, and I like the quote, so I want to read it. Concentrated animal feeding operations are comparable to poorly run hospitals, where everyone is given antibiotics, patients lie in unchanged beds, hygiene is non-existent, Infections and reinfections are rife. Waste is thrown out the window, and visitors enter and leave at will. So given this environment, it's no surprise that contaminated meat and poultry infections make up to 3 million people sick every year and kill at least 1,000. And those are figures that are probably unreported. I just read an article in the New Yorker coming down here. Salmonella alone, which comes from poultry and eggs principally, sends up to 19,000 people a year to the hospital. It kills more people than any other human pathogen. A recent USDA study found that 24% of all cut chicken parts are contaminated with salmonella. And a recent outbreak at Purdue may have sent 18,000 people to the hospital. And to be clear, I'm not talking about a slight fever and a stomach ache. I'm talking about serious cases like organ failure, sepsis, paralysis, and crippling and irreversible arthritis. Salmonella poisoning and E. coli poisoning can kill. So what's going on here? Why all this food poisoning? And there's really three things. The first is the conditions of confinement. Crammed into tight containment areas in massive numbers, factory farmed animals often become caked with their own feces. The second problem comes at the level of slaughterhouses and poultry processing plants. Whereas one source puts it, the incessant increases in speed, which is what TJ talked about today, the drive for profit and the huge scale have resulted in contamination and massive meat recalls. Increasingly, the industry is putting the onus on workers to be the ones to identify and pull like the contaminated chicken off the line, as if the workers have the time or the ability to do this. And the third problem is a massive failure at the US governmental level. One of the earlier speakers alluded to this as well. I think it was Chris. He talked about the USDA, which views its principal mission as protecting the agriculture industry. It's not about protecting the animals, and it's not about protecting people from adulterated food. So the upshot of all this is that we have massive, massive problems with food poisoning on a previously unimaginable scale. But really, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the human health impacts of the food that comes out of factory farms. And this is where I get to my next topic, which is, what about all the drugs that we give animals in CAFOS? And I have to give thanks to Paige for this part of my presentation. Paige is from the Center for Food Safety. The Center for Food Safety has already done a ton of amazing work in this area. And they're preparing a study on this, a new study on this. And I took most of this from the center's study, which is yet to go public. But you know, I didn't know about any of this a month ago when I started preparing for this talk. I knew about the antibiotics, which is the first thing up there, but I did not know about beta agonists, steroid hormones, or arsenicals. So just real quick on these. Paige is going to talk about antibiotics, but just some fun facts for you. The non-therapeutic use of antibiotics, which means the use of antibiotics on animals who are not sick, accounts for 70 to 80% of total antibiotic consumption in the United States. And the World Health Organization says that without urgent action, we're heading for a post-antibiotic era in which common infections and minor injuries can once again kill. The problem is so serious that it threatens the achievement of modern medicine. Think about that. The number one achievement of modern medicine in this century is antibiotics. A post-antibiotic era in which common infections and minor injuries can kill, far from being an apocalyptic fantasy, is instead a very real possibility for the 21st century. Now that in and of itself is reason enough to change the way business is done. The reason the animals are given all these antibiotics is because from birth is that they cannot survive the close confinement in animal factories. If you take away the industry's ability to use the antibiotics, then they have to change the conditions of confinement. But the meat industry doesn't want to do that because it's going to cut back on its products. I looked at the American Meat Association's website just to see what they had to say about antibiotic use. They said a bunch of crap, but this is my favorite. When used judiciously, Antibiotics are part of a farmer's and veterinarian's toolbox to maintain animal health. In other words, we need to use them to keep the animals well. This is my favorite. The vast majority of antibiotics are used either in people or in animals, but not in both. I have no idea what that means. In any event, the antibiotic issue alone it's crazy. It's out of control. It threatens to wipe out modern medicine, and that might be the best thing that could happen if mass numbers of people. I mean, what do we have? 75 million people died from the Black Death during the Middle Ages, and maybe this is what it takes to bring the human race into line. In any event, God, I just realized I have gum in my mouth. This is so tacky. Let's talk about beta agonists, okay? I didn't even know about beta agonists like 3 weeks ago. And I'm reminded of, there's this author named Anne Lamott, who I love, who tells this story about her cousin or her niece who was talking to her about something that she had read about Hitler. And she had read that Hitler had actually been having an affair with his niece. And she was like, that's it, I am done with Hitler. And that's kind of how I felt when I learned about ractopamine. It's like, that's it, I'm done with the CAFOS, that's it. That's the last straw. Anyway, ractopamine. So it's used to accelerate weight gain and promote feed efficiency and leanness in animals, pigs, cattle, turkeys. I'll just toss it. Thank you. And it's awful, awful, awful stuff. I think Chris said that it's outlawed in China. It's outlawed in something like 160 countries. How does it work? The animal factories, they give it to the animals in the last couple months of their life. Another euphemism, the finishing phase. It mimics stress hormones, increasing heart rate and relaxing their blood vessels. It's linked to cardiovascular stress, tremors, increased activity, hyperactivity, and acute toxicity. It's terrible, terrible stuff. It makes the animals extremely sick, crazy, and often kills them outright. Ractopamine also increases the number of downer or lame animals. Animals that are so sick they can't walk. Those are the cows that in TJ's video were having to be dragged out of the CAFO. So how do beta agonists affect humans? Well, here's the thing. We don't really know for sure because the United States government doesn't really want to study it. And that's a common theme throughout here. We have a lot of drugs that are on the market that are being used for animals. We don't have definitive research about what they do to humans, but we have a lot of reasons to suspect that they do some very, very bad things. And the United States' government approach is, we don't want to know, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. We will do nothing about this. We don't want to know. There have been a few studies of beta agonists, though. In one small sample study of 6 men, one was removed from the study when he began experiencing an abnormally rapid heart rate. Studies of rhesus monkeys shows that ractopamine elevates heart rates for 16 hours after dosing. Like I said, it's banned in 160 countries. And the FDA does nothing. Interestingly, so as with the vast majority of animal drugs used in the US industrial system, FDA's approval of ractopamine relies primarily on studies conducted by the drug manufacturer, and this is the classic example of the fox guarding the hen house. Incidentally, the same thing happens with a lot of human drugs, too. The FDA relies on clinical evidence that are submitted by the actual drug manufacturers. But in the context of animal drugs, many of the studies are focused not on human health or animal welfare impacts, but rather on the most economical ways to raise meat products, another euphemism, more quickly. Okay, let's just talk quickly about steroid hormones. We've all heard about that. Again, used in the industry to increase animal growth and the leanness of the meat. It's used to increase milk production in the dairy industry. American Public Health Association says there's clear evidence that hormones taken in from the outside can affect hormone rates in humans. Once again, there's no definitive studies. The United States government is see no evil, hear no evil, but we know that for girls, taking in hormones from the outside from animal products can cause central precocious puberty, which is breast development in children under 8. It can reduce sperm counts in boys. And what do other countries do? Here again, the United States, as somebody said, we're the big barbarians. The European Union has banned all hormones in beef. In Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the EU have banned rBGH, which is, I think, the hormone that's used in milk. And the American approach, again, no major studies are underway in the US to evaluate the safety of hormones in meat and milk. Let's just talk quickly about arsenic, another really bad drug used for weight gain. FDA says fine, USDA says fine, does all sorts of terrible things. The Europeans say no. Arsenic has never been approved for animal feed in the European Union and is listed in the European Commission's regulations as an undesirable feed contaminant. And in America, so that's Nero fiddling while Rome burns. And the reason I put that in there is that in 2013, nearly 4 years after the Center for Food Safety petitioned the agency to withdraw the approval for the 4 major arsenicals approved by the agency, the FDA finally responded by agreeing to withdraw 3 of the 4. Actually, the agency only agreed to ban these drugs after the companies that make them decided to voluntarily withdraw them. Meanwhile, though, the 4th drug is still on the market, which means that there is still arsenic in your chicken. And then the FDA is still evaluating and considering nothing ever happens. So the bottom line is that if you are what you eat, then you're in a lot of trouble if you eat factory farmed meat and dairy. So the grassy knoll, if those of you who are of my generation can remember that this is a euphemism for a conspiracy theory. What the hell is going on here? We're living in one of the most progressive, wealthy, blessed, lucky, advanced, technologically sophisticated countries in the world. Why is it that we have a holocaust going on a daily basis with regard to animals, and a holocaust for human health as well? Why isn't the government doing anything? And I think it comes down to money. 10 of the biggest lobbies in Washington, here they are. And number 4 is agribusiness, and number 7 is big pharma, and they work hand in hand, right? 450 drugs go into the animal industry to keep the animals alive so that we could torture them and eat them. And who makes the money? It's pharma, especially with all those antibiotics. So drug companies enjoy more power and influence in America than with any other government in the world. Agricultural business lobbyists spend upward of $150 million each year on campaigns and legislation. So it's small wonder that we've got this problem. Let me move on to toxic workplaces. Here we're talking about slaughterhouses and poultry processing plants. I can cover this pretty quickly because I think what TJ said today kind of speaks volumes. There's nothing I could say that would possibly, I think, make a bigger impact. But there are some statistics that people should know about. So the workers in the meat industry make an average of $23,000 a year. And they work 10 hours a day on average and are pushed so hard they often defecate in their pants to avoid slowing down and suffer repetitive motion and injury rates 30 times the national average. Counties with slaughterhouses, also not surprisingly, have 4 times the national average of violent arrests with significantly higher rates of alcoholism, domestic abuse, and child abuse and suicide. Yesterday I was sitting with TJ at dinner and he was telling me that in these CAFOS where he's gone undercover, the companies, there's also really high incidence of just the humans attacking each other because being in that environment of violence begets violence, not just against the animals, but against the humans. So it's a nightmare for the humans too, and I never really thought about that much, but you know, I don't think that this is a bunch of sadistic brutes who are working these industries. These are, as I should have said earlier, undocumented workers largely, and just very poor people who are desperate and have no place else to go. The situation in these industries is horrendous in terms of public safety. Traumatic injuries is a big deal. The slaughterhouse employees handle and are surrounded by knives, saws, hooks, bolt guns, scalding liquids, and all the large machinery common to assembly line production. particularly in the poultry industry, but the musculoskeletal disorders are more than 5 times the national average for all US industries. The disease exposure is rampant. According to the General Accounting Office, CAFO and slaughterhouse workers are surrounded by huge numbers of living and dead animals. They're the front line of exposure to superbugs. Those are the antibiotic-resistant bugs. Contact with different bacteria can cause fever, headaches, vomiting, diarrhea, and kidney damage and nosebleeds, as we heard today. And then the emissions, the dangerous emissions. We're talking about chemicals, ammonia, chlorine, phosphoric acid, sodium hydroxide. The GAO report says that workers have died by being overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas and from drowning when they entered manure waste pits or unknowingly working towards manure waste lagoons without taking the proper precautions. So the US government response is really astounding here. So the USDA recently denied a petition for a petition to reduce the work speed lines in poultry processing plants. And in their letter, this is dated just February of this year, the agency said, we're aware of the serious safety and health hazards facing meat and poultry workers. We recognize that the incidence of occupational injuries is more than 5 times the average, and that the incidence of repetitive stress in meat packing is almost 10 times the private sector average. But they concluded that the agency's limited resources do not allow for a comprehensive analysis and rulemaking effort. And what about the USDA? So the USDA, this is astonishing. Last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, anyway, they issued these proposed rules that actually proposed to increase the line speeds for poultry processing workers from 140 birds a minute to 175 birds a minute. And there was a huge public outcry, thousands of comments submitted, lots of different human rights organizations got involved, and ultimately the agency agreed to back down. They said, okay, we're not going to increase the line speeds, but what we're going to do is they decreased the number of inspectors on the line. And they actually said that this would be an increased food safety measure because instead of the inspectors inspecting, now it's the workers who are inspecting. And they're relying on more chemicals to come down and douse the birds. Anyway, it's just preposterous. The whole thing is a complete mess. And again, the US government is just a complete failure, and I think it's because of money. Let me just say a few words about toxic communities. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I do think it's important that we look at the problem of human health holistically, as one of my colleagues said. And so it's just important to touch on it. It's not just the food poisoning, it's not just the animal drugs, and it's not just the miserable wretches who are working in the poultry processing and slaughterhouse and CAFO industries. It's also the neighbors. So that's a North Carolina hog waste lagoon, and you can see what happens. The pink is from all of the chemicals that's in the waste. It causes just horrendous odor, headaches, eye irritation, nausea. But it's not just about the smell. We're also talking about hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, particulate matter, and these things create very serious respiratory problems, very serious eye problems, sometimes chronic neurobehavioral problems, mental illnesses, excessive coughing, diarrhea, burning eyes, children with asthma. It just goes on and on. We're litigating a case against N&M Dairy in San Bernardino County in Los Angeles, and the people in that area, there are so many flies in their houses that they have to take turns at the dinner table so that one can whack the flies off the food and the other can actually eat. They can't go outside. The smell is too atrocious. The children can't play outside. I mean, it's decimated their neighborhood. These CAFOs come in and they decimate rural communities. And then there's groundwater and surface water contamination. My colleague Eli is going to be talking more about that, but it's not uncommon for a CAFO on 10 acres to generate the same amount of sewage of a city of 100,000 inhabitants. You just have to look at this picture. That's a so-called lagoon from a hog farm. And the water contamination from CAFOS has terrible health problems, including nitrates, which leads to birth defects, disruption of thyroid functions, and various things. I'm going to skip over Yakima Valley because Eli's going to talk about that. And then the last, the mega human health impact, of course, is the greenhouse gases, which you've also heard already a little bit about today, but 1/2 of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from CAFOs. And part of it is just from the actual the manure that comes out of them. The methane produced from CAFO lagoons are 70% more damaging per ton to the Earth's atmosphere than CO2. So the bottom line of all this is that the American Public Health Association has actually issued a resolution urging state and local officials to impose a precautionary moratorium on the construction of new factory farms. Is that going to happen? Somehow I doubt it, but that's why we're here today, to make sure that there's hopefully some progress towards that. And that's just a baby hedgehog that I thought was really, really cute. Isn't that fantastic? I think if we could just drop a bunch of baby hedgehogs from airplanes in very, very safe baskets with like cozy interiors, a lot of the world problems will be solved. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. That's my info. Call me. Thank you. You're on it? Okay.
Self-explanatory. All right, everyone ready? My name is Paige Tomaselli again, and I work at the Center for Food Safety. I work to protect human health and the environment by curbing the proliferation of harmful food technologies. Well, what does that mean? We basically work to combat things like genetic engineering, pesticides, sewage sludge, and of course, concentrated animal feeding operations, or what I like to call animal factories. And we promote organic and other forms of sustainable agriculture. I'm a litigator, so most of what I do is work litigating these issues, suing the US government, administrative law. And as Leslie said, today I'm really gonna focus in on antibiotic use because it's such a huge public health crisis. And a couple of my slides might overlap with a few of the facts that Leslie had in the beginning, but I promise we'll get over that and there'll be new information. I'm going to give kind of an overview of the antibiotic issue, a history of what's been going on the last 40 or so years, and then I'll end with what's going on or what's not going on in the US with regard to this issue. So like Leslie said, there are a variety of animal drugs that are used in the United States, and they're really just one of many industry crutches in the animal factory industry. Other crutches are the cheap labor or the workforce, the lax enforcement of environmental statutes, subsidies, and of course, then there's animal drugs. Like Leslie said, there's a bunch of different categories. I'm not gonna go over them because the point of this talk today is to talk about antibiotics. And Leslie gave this fact, but just again, to give you an idea of the scale of antibiotic use in this country, 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are sold and administered to food animals. And 70% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are sold and used for non-therapeutic reasons. So like Leslie said, therapeutic means to treat or cure a known disease. And non-therapeutic is, of course, not to use to treat or cure a known disease. And there are two main kinds of non-therapeutic uses. There are growth promotion uses, which is feeding low doses of antibiotics to animals to promote weight gain. And there are disease prevention uses, which basically means prophylactic dosing at low doses in an animal's food or water. And we believe that the non-therapeutic uses are driven by purely economic motives. And the most troubling of these motives is really the weight gain motive, or what they call feed efficiency, which is just increasing the amount of weight an animal would gain per unit of feed. There's really no other reason but to get the animal to market weight faster. And so the industry will say, well, non-therapeutic uses, they equate to cheap meat at the grocery store. But as Leslie just explained, that meat really isn't cheap, and there's a lot of human health impacts and other impacts that really come along with that meat. And the National Research Council would say something different. They would say maintaining animal health and comfort, well-being, such as doing novel things like increasing the amount of space per animal or controlling the temperature in the facility, allowing animals to engage in natural behaviors and feeding them a naturally suited diet. Those things actually could reduce drug use and cut costs. In fact, a ban on non-therapeutic use would only increase costs per consumer $5 to $10 a year, which is a very small price to pay to ensure that if you actually got sick, those antibiotics the doctor prescribed to you would work. So Alexander Fleming, well, for those of you who don't know, was a Scottish biologist and pharmacologist, and he's the guy who discovered the first antibiotic. And he warned the scientific community about the dangers of antibiotic resistance 70 years ago. He said, "The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug. He'll make them resistant." Well, 70 years later, this premonition has become a reality, but it's not because you and I can go down to the pharmacy or Walgreens or whatever and pick up some antibiotics and then not give ourselves the proper dose. It's because we are administering improper doses, low doses of antibiotics to healthy animals in animal factories. And so now there's an epidemic of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that is happening at these facilities, and these antibiotic-resistant bacteria are being transmitted to human beings in a number of ways. They are present in the environment, so they're present in the water, and they're present in the air. Just last year, there's a study out of Texas that said antibiotic-resistant bacteria are actually present in the dust coming off of these animal factories. They're also present in the food products that people eat. When you go to the store, or when someone goes to the store and purchases chicken and brings that chicken home and does not cook the chicken properly, antibiotic-resistant bacteria could be there and then infect those people. And then, of course, as Leslie said, there are also antibiotic-resistant bacteria come home with the workers, and then those workers are spreading that bacteria to their friends, their family, their community members, and it's a vicious cycle of how these bacteria are getting into our systems. And of course, this isn't a problem that is only happening in the United States. It is a global problem. And just the other day, just last week, according to scientists at Princeton, a study came out and they said antibiotic use is expected to surge by 2/3 globally and between 2010 and 2030, and doubling in places like China, Brazil, India, and Russia. And they also studied why, and somebody said this earlier, but it's really because in lower and middle income countries, people are making more money. And with more money, they're buying more animal protein. In fact, if you take Asia for an example, the daily animal protein intake in Asia grew from 7 grams per capita per day in 1960 to 25 grams per capita per day in 2013. And then, of course, the percentage of the diet coming from grains like rice and wheat is also progressively decreasing. So to meet this demand, countries, again, such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have shifted toward this highly cost-efficient and vertically integrated system of livestock like we have in this country, which is apparently working so well. But you can see that our friends in India, actually our vegan friends in India, it hasn't really moved very much. So the production systems necessitate the antibiotics to keep animals healthy in these crowded and unsanitary and often extremely inhumane conditions. And that's where we're at a global level. But of course, scientists didn't discover this last week or even last year or even 5 years ago. They've known about the problem with antibiotic-resistant bacteria for decades. Scientists in the late 60s have expressed concern about antimicrobial feed additives and that the concern that these lead to the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And beginning in the late 60s, countries definitely started to take notice, and that started with folks in the UK. Following a prolonged outbreak of salmonella contamination and deaths in the 1960s, the UK convened a joint committee to determine whether to regulate antibiotics in food animals. And the committee reported that the administration of antimicrobials in food-producing animals, particularly at subtherapeutic levels, poses a hazard to human health. And they concluded that basically antibiotics should only be fed or only be administered to treat sick animals and only under the supervision of a veterinarian. So really, it was a novel idea. And of course, you've probably all heard the expression, almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Well, in the 1970s, the US got really close to acting on this, right after the UK. In 1970, the US followed a UK suit and assembled its own task force on antibiotic use in animal feed and antibiotic resistance. The task force came to the same conclusion as the UK committee, which was to prohibit the non-therapeutic administration of certain antimicrobial drugs commonly used in human clinical medicine. And this prompted FDA to reach out to all of the sponsors of these drugs and ask them for proof that these drugs did not create antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And when they couldn't do so, in 1977, the FDA decided that it was going to withdraw two very important critical human antibiotics, penicillin and tetracycline. Of course, Congress said no. They disagreed with FDA and directed FDA to research the issue more. Basically, critics say that influential farm state legislators led the opposition, no surprises there, at the urging of the farming and the pharmaceutical industries. So FDA delegated more research. For 20 years, they researched, and the research was fairly conclusive that the overuse of antibiotics is a human health hazard. So in 1980, the National Academy of Sciences found hazards may exist. Then 4 years later, Saddle King County studied that bacteria do flow from poultry to humans during consumption. So they proved the fact that if you eat the meat and it's got the resistant bacteria, you can get sick. In 1987, the Institute of Medicine found considerable evidence that antibiotic use in agriculture is a human health hazard. And in 1999, GAO reported that antibiotics should not be used in animal feed to promote growth. Of course, there were international examples as well, probably the most famous of which comes out of Denmark. We call it the Danish experiment. For those of you who don't know, Denmark is a major food producer and at one time was the world's largest exporter of pork. Like the United States, they have highly intensive, highly industrialized pork production systems, and their government actually recognizing the potential for public health crisis and listening to their consumers who were concerned about food safety, unlike our own government, they decided to stop the administration of antibiotics used for growth promotion in broiler chickens and adult swine in 1998 and young swine in 1999. And now today, in order to administer antibiotics to animals in Denmark, you need a valid prescription, just like a human being would. And vets are also prohibited from profiting from the sale of antibiotics. It's another novel idea that veterinarians shouldn't be profiting from the sale of antibiotics to the livestock industry, something I wish that we would adopt here. But the Danes also learned that you can't just reduce antibiotic use, you have to make small fundamental changes to your industrial system. So they learned that they have to wean pigs later and reduce the density of animals, change the airflow to minimize disease transmission and find better breeds. All of these things, the same things that the National Research Council is telling the United States that we have to do. And so just to sum it up, despite critics' attempts to claim that the measures in Denmark were both costly and ineffective, both Denmark and outside observers plainly indicate otherwise. Antibiotic use in Denmark has drastically declined since the ban, and it's, from 1992 to 2011, antibiotic use has dropped by 50%, and there's also a corresponding drop in antibiotic resistance. So here's a timeline of international action. Countries all over Europe learned from Denmark and Sweden and the UK. I believe it was Carter who said this morning that the EU is probably the most advanced as far as regulating animal factories and industrial animal agriculture is concerned. And they've really made a lot of steps, or taken a lot of steps, to eliminate animal drugs and specifically antibiotics from production in the EU. However, the EU, while they banned some non-therapeutic uses of antibiotics specifically for growth promotion, they did not ban the uses for disease prevention, and so they still do have significant problems with antibiotic resistance in the EU, although several of the member countries have gone much further. And then finally, in 2000, the World Health Organization issued a global call to action stating that ongoing and often low-level dosing for growth and prophylactics inevitably results in the development of resistant bacteria in or near livestock, and recommended that countries tackle the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria by, again, requiring veterinarians to issue prescriptions in order to use antibiotics and not using these drugs to do anything other than treat disease. Meanwhile, that was 23 years after FDA initially decided that it was going to withdraw penicillin and tetracycline, and still at that time FDA had done nothing. So because this room is filled with a lot of attorneys and law students, I kind of want to just quickly go over the statute in the United States that regulates animal drugs, and that's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Congress has tasked FDA with the mission of promoting and protecting public health by, quote, promptly and efficiently reviewing clinical research and taking appropriate action on the marketing of regulated products in a timely manner, which they have clearly failed to do with regard to antibiotics. And of course, ensuring regulated products are safe, wholesome, sanitary, and properly labeled. The FFDCA governs the use of all new animal drugs. New animal drug is defined as any drug intended for the use in animals other than man, including any drug intended for use in animal feed. The FFDCA is basically a cost-benefit statute, so FDA doesn't determine the absolute safety of a drug. Instead, they determine whether the benefits of that drug will outweigh the cost of its restricted use. However, FDA does have authority to suspend or withdraw approval of drugs on its own, which it rarely ever does. And it also has a mandatory duty to withdraw the approval of an animal drug when it finds that drug to be unsafe. Of course, because FDA barely ever withdraws animal drugs on its own, the FFDCA does guarantee the right for a citizen to petition FDA to issue, amend, or revoke a regulation or an order. And oftentimes, citizen groups like the Center for Food Safety and others are petitioning FDA to withdraw certain animal drugs. And also, that is protected in your constitutional rights in the First Amendment. And so that's basically what's happened here. In 1999 and 2005, environmental groups petitioned FDA demanding that FDA move forward with its 1977 proposal to ban tetracycline and penicillin, as well as extend the ban to other antibiotics. And of course, if any of you have ever tried to petition FDA, you know that FDA generally ignores these petitions for a long time, several years, to the point where you are forced to sue them for unreasonable delay in responding to your petition. And that's what the groups did here. In 2011, think of how many years that is. In 2011, when this all started in 1977, NRDC and the rest of those groups that had petitioned FDA in 1999 and 2005, they filed an unreasonable delay lawsuit against FDA, asking FDA to first take action on that 1977 withdrawal notice for penicillin and tetracycline, and also answer those petitions. Well, that's what FDA did. It said, we got sued, we'll finally answer those petitions and deal with the withdrawal notice. Well, they withdrew that 1977 notice, basically saying that withdrawals of animal drugs take an inordinate amount of time, and they're working on voluntary measures with the industry to combat antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and they also denied the citizen petitions. So The NRDC group amended its complaint and challenged those denials, and in 2012, Federal District Court in the Southern District of New York actually agreed with NRDC and directed FDA to move forward with the 1977 withdrawals. Of course, FDA didn't agree, and they appealed to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit reversed. So NRDC and the district court had one theory, which is that FDA's decision to initiate the withdrawal proceedings in 1977 created a non-discretionary duty or a mandatory duty to have a hearing on the safety of these drugs, and unless the industry could rebut the presumption that these drugs were unsafe, then FDA had to withdraw the drugs. However, the FDA and the Second Circuit had a different theory. Their theory is that FDA's duty to withdraw an animal drug is only mandatory after the hearing. And so now that's the interpretation of the FFDCA that sticks, which is really unfortunate because it shifted the burden. So FDA could come out and say that something is unsafe and they could decide maybe I'm gonna withdraw it, and if they never go through with that hearing, then they could just change their mind at any time and say, oops, we're sorry, we're gonna go ahead with some voluntary measures. We absolutely disagree with this interpretation of the statute, and at some point we'd like to test it in another circuit. So we're basically stuck now with FDA's voluntary actions, and there's two guidance documents, Guidance 209 and Guidance 213. And for any of you that know, guidance documents are these non-legally binding documents. They really don't mean anything. So first, FDA came out with Guidance 209 several years ago, which sounded pretty good. FDA was saying that they wanted to discontinue the administration of medically important antibiotics as growth promoters and really only use antibiotics to treat truly sick animals. Also require veterinary supervision. Again, it's a guidance document, but the wording was right, and it sounded like a really good idea and that they were onto something. But then, in a couple of years later, they came out with Guidance 213, and they defined the appropriate therapeutic use of antibiotics in food animals as the treatment, control, and prevention of specific diseases. So you have that disease prevention, you have that prophylactic dosing of the entire flock or herd, which negates all of the good things that could possibly be done, because what the industry is now doing is they're changing their labels and saying, well, we're not using growth promotion, like this antibiotic is no longer valid for growth promotion, but it's valid for disease prevention. So you really have no shift in the amount of antibiotics used, you're just changing the semantics, you're just changing the wording. And so now these are the guidance documents that are in place. We know that they're not enough. They're voluntary measures. They allow for use in disease prevention, and there's nothing in place that really forces FDA to evaluate the effectiveness of these guidance documents. So you have to look to other measures, and a small group of senators and congresspeople, they've been trying to address the issue through legislation. Representative Louise Slaughter and Senator Dianne Feinstein, they have long supported bills such as the Preservation of Antibiotics for Medical Treatment Act and the Preventing Antibiotic Resistance Act. And then Henry Waxman has also introduced the Delivering Antimicrobial Transparency in Animals Act, or the DATA Act, because that's a mouthful. Because in the United States, not only do we not regulate the use of antibiotics, but we don't track the amount of antibiotics being used. And so we have absolutely no way of knowing what the on-farm usage of antibiotics is, and that's just not in the FFDCA. Unfortunately, federal legislation has so far been unsuccessful. And finally, the White House convened a task force on antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and just yesterday they came out with their national plan. And there's some good language about prevention and containment of outbreaks and maintaining efficacy of antibiotics, but that's all great. Really not focused on agriculture. In fact, their plan, it was so disappointing, it just reiterated Guidance 213. It said it doesn't speak at all to disease prevention uses, and it says that it has no real timeline, and there's no real data gathering provisions in it either. So it's just more lip service and really, truly ineffective. So now the last thing I wanted to talk about is where do we go from here, and what are we working on? And because all of these measures have not gone far enough, there's a coalition of public health environmental groups working to fight antibiotic resistance in a number of other ways. We're now working at a state policy level because obviously the federal government isn't going to do anything. There's a bunch of legislation that's been proposed this year in states like California and Oregon, which would ban the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics. And Carter mentioned this earlier, and he said that HSUS has been leading a case against FDA. Well, actually, I would say Center for Food Safety has been leading the case, but actually HSUS and CFS have been working together on a case against FDA challenging the approval of 18 different animal drugs, all of which contain ractopamine, which was the beta agonist that Leslie was talking about, but many of which also contain antibiotics, and we're challenging that under the National Environmental Policy Act because FDA, when it approves animal drugs, it approves them once with the main drug with an environmental assessment, but then again, it doesn't do any further assessment after that and instead relies on categorical exclusions to approve drug after drug after drug and combination drugs that have never been studied before. So you have an antibiotic, a steroid, and a beta agonist together in one drug, and you're not studying the impacts that's going to have on the animal, on the environment, on the water system, on human beings. You're just approving them because they've all been approved together before. And then, of course, there's market campaigns where folks are trying to get major food producers and restaurant chains and corporations to commit to only using products that are antibiotic-free or where antibiotics have only been used to treat sick animals. And that's kind of where we're at today in the United States. So there's my contact information. That's it.
Well, thank you, Paige and Leslie. Your talks reminded me, because you focus so much on the failure of the FDA and the USDA, you reminded me of this great line from Rory Friedman's book, Skinny Bitch, in which he says, government agencies don't give a shit about your health. And it's really true, isn't it? It's a real pleasure for me to be here. As you might have heard in my bio, I went to law school here. I sat in this room to learn civil procedure from the great Erwin Chemerinsky, who's famous for giving all of his lectures without any notes whatsoever, without any outline, just as he's famous for arguing all of his cases in the US Supreme Court without any notes. And one of the great sources of comfort for me being back here after all these years is knowing that the statute of limitations is finally run on all those library book fines. I wrote a book called Meatonomics, which looks at the economic forces and consequences of the animal food production industry in this country. And I'm most interested in those impacts on consumers, but in my talk I'm going to talk about consumers, workers, and small farmers. The particular phenomenon that I'm interested in with respect to consumers is that, in my view, the animal food industry in this country unfairly influences consumers to purchase animal food products and to engage in decisions about how much of those products to buy in a way that literally deprives consumers of the ability to exercise informed and independent decision-making about how much and what to buy. And I'll talk about that a little bit. First, I want to talk about some of the terminology that I'll use. The EPA defines CAFOS. And a CAFO is defined as a facility where animals spend 45 or more days per year, where certain size thresholds are met, and most importantly, where no vegetation is produced. Now, I mean, that really says it all. There's no vegetation whatsoever. It's a concrete and steel factory. That's why we call them factory farms. There are about 2 million farms total in this country, and the EPA tells us that about 19,000 of those are CAFOs. We also know that notwithstanding that only about 1% of the farms in this country are CAFOs, or factory farms, that 1% is responsible for about 99% of the output of all animal foods that Americans consume each year. So statistically speaking, when we talk about animal agriculture in this country, we're talking about CAFOS, basically. And yes, it's nice that there's a Susie's Farm in San Diego where you can go and buy a so-called humanely raised chicken, but statistically they just don't add up. Polyface Farm, for example, the farm profiled by Michael Pollan in his book Omnivore's Dilemma, produces only enough meat to feed about 700 people per year. So while it's a nice novelty, and while that may be the future of sustainable farming, today, statistically, they just don't count for much. So we're really talking about CAFOs. In 1932, Aldous Huxley published this great book, Brave New World. Now, the title is ironic because the future that Huxley envisioned was not really a brave and new one. It was a creepy, dark, dystopian future where the government will exist for just one purpose, and that's to get consumers to buy more goods. In the Huxleyan future, because it's so important for the economy, for people to buy things, the government bombards its citizens with messages. So for example, because it's better to buy a new pair of pants or a new shirt rather than to sew up old clothing, the messages say things like, ending is better than mending, or the more stitches, the less riches. I submit to you that we are living in a version of this Huxleyan future today, because to go back to my first slide, these messages, beef, it's what's for dinner, milk life, or got milk, or milk, it does a body good. These messages are messages from our government. And I know that that's surprising. I want to explain that. In this country, we have this phenomenon called checkoff programs. A checkoff program is a program created by Congress. Most people haven't heard of them unless they're very familiar with the way they work. We've all seen the messaging. We've seen it on billboards, on the internet, on TV, in magazines. But we haven't really heard of these programs. We don't really know how they work. How they work is pretty simple. At the first wholesale transaction involving an animal food, including beef, pork, dairy, fluid milk, eggs, and lamb, the wholesale buyer, let's say a slaughterhouse buying from a rancher, collects and remits a small tax. In this case, if in the case of cattle, it's $1 per animal. An organization collects those funds and disburses them for the purpose of marketing the goods at issue. So the beef checkoff collects funds to market beef. Now, industry is fond of saying, this is a completely private endeavor. We're collecting the funds, we're responsible for the funds, we're spending the funds. No, it's private. And the implication is, leave us alone, get off our backs. This is just like McDonald's advertising, buy a Big Mac. In fact, that's completely false. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Johans versus Livestock Marketing. In that case, the court found, because the USDA appoints the leadership of checkoff programs, because it monitors their collection and spending of funds, because it monitors their messaging and can veto and edit their messages, the USDA is so integrally involved in checkoffs that when a checkoff program speaks, when you see beef, it's what's for dinner, according to the US Supreme Court, that is government speech. That is the United States federal government telling you to eat more beef. That's a settled matter as a matter of law. The highest court in the land has spoken on it. It's not subject to debate. Now, I think that's pretty creepy. I think it's pretty big brother-ish. Perhaps it wouldn't be so creepy and scary if these programs were not so incredibly effective. But guess what? They're really, really effective. According to data released by the checkoff programs themselves, in a typical year, they raise and spend about $550 million. They have an average 8-to-1 return on investment, and the result is about an extra $4.6 billion in sales to animal foods, resulting from the US federal government telling us beef, it's what's for dinner, and bombarding us with those messages just like Huxley warned us they would. Now, you might say, well, that's good. We're emerging from a recession. We need to boost the economy. This is good because it's creating jobs. There's a multiplier effect. Well, I would suggest that perhaps this is not helping us. In fact, according to USDA data, in virtually every age and sex demographic in this country, Americans already consume somewhere between more animal foods and much, much more animal foods than we should. And you can see that in the group of males, 30 to 50 basically, it's 50% or more the animal foods that the USDA itself recommends. Why is this a problem? Americans consume almost 200 pounds per person of meat per year. We have doubled our consumption in the last 80 years. Depending on which ranking you look at, we're either in the number 2 or number 3 in the world for per capita meat consumption. 2 in 3 Americans is overweight. 1 in 3 is obese. We have 3 times the cancer rate of the rest of the world. We have twice the rate of diabetes, twice the rate of obesity. Now, these diseases are not strictly related to animal food consumption, but the clinical literature tells us that they're largely related to animal food consumption. So our government is telling us to eat more of the very things that are making us sick and fat. Let me look at another way that animal food producers, CAFOS, influence consumers. And that is that in the last several decades, they've embarked on this incredibly aggressive legislative campaign to make it difficult for consumers to investigate, criticize, or sue them. I'll skip ag-gag laws because I know those have been addressed. I want to just briefly explain what some of these are in case you're not familiar with them, because some of them are pretty bizarre. Food defamation laws that we've got in a quarter of the states in this country. These are laws that say that literally, if you defame food, which is to say, if you say something that is damaging and untrue about food, you can be sued. Oprah Winfrey learned this the hard way when she had Howard Lyman on her show 15 years ago or so. Howard Lyman, as you may know, is a former cattle rancher. He's now a vegan advocate. They were talking about the beef production industry. And after the show aired, the Texas Cattlemen's Beef Association brought a lawsuit against both of them, which they later prevailed in, but only after spending an estimated $1 million in attorney's fees. So you can understand that these laws, among other things, do have the potential to chill free speech. Cheeseburger laws that we have in half of the states in this country are laws that say that a plaintiff cannot recover against a manufacturer, distributor, or retailer of food based on the theory that food made the plaintiff obese or contributed to an obesity-related disease. The proponents of these laws are very clear that the purpose of the laws is to prevent the kind of large judgments and awards that we've seen in the tobacco industry in the past couple of decades. As you may be aware, Big Tobacco has paid Medicaid programs in this country over $400 billion because of the health costs associated with tobacco use. Now, notwithstanding that we have procedures in every state for defendants to get frivolous lawsuits dismissed, we now have this legislation in half of the states that prevent these lawsuits from even being brought in the first place. Let me come back to customary farming exemptions. Animal and ecological terrorism laws. These are laws that we have in 4 out of 5 states in this country and at the federal level that provide for enhanced criminal penalties for what would otherwise be relatively innocuous crimes like vandalism or trespassing when the target of the crime is an animal enterprise, which means basically anything involving animals. So certainly a factory farm or CAFO, but also a restaurant, grocery store, testing facility, et cetera. When I was writing my book, I was interested in understanding better the proposed reason for these laws, which is that we need to protect the safety of our food system in this country from food terrorists. And I was unable to find any evidence that we actually have or have ever had a food terrorism problem in this country. There's never been a food terrorism case on the FBI's list of major terrorism cases, and the only 2 cases that I found going back decades were local, minor, and involved no fatalities. And in fact, the issue really, as I think Will Potter will probably discuss later when he talks about his great book, Green is the New Red, is that there's a green scare in this country, and the result has been to label environmental and animal activists as terrorists, and that marginalizes them and turns what would otherwise be either legal or relatively innocuous civil disobedience into a fairly serious crime. Let's talk about customary farming exemptions, because I think this is sort of the most important sort of legislation that is passed. A customary farming exemption has the effect of taking a state's general animal anti-cruelty statute and carving out an exemption for farm animals. And I want to read you an example of how this works because I think it's particularly illustrative. In 1854, the Connecticut legislature adopted a general anti-cruelty statute which prohibited cruelty to, quote, any animal, unquote. You can't really get any broader than that. That's a pretty good statute. That statute was in effect for almost 150 years. Unfortunately, in 1996, Connecticut adopted a customary farming exemption. And here's what that statute now says. It is legal in Connecticut to, quote, maliciously and intentionally maim, mutilate, torture, wound, or kill an animal, provided the act is done while following generally accepted agricultural practices, unquote. To paraphrase, in Connecticut, it's legal to intentionally torture a farm animal. Now, this Connecticut language is particularly evocative, and that's why I use it, but the same principle applies in all of the 37 states that have this legislation, and it applies in the other 13 states that don't because they've adopted the same thing through the process of judicial decision-making or the common law. So we can say that effectively, in all 50 states in this country, it is legal to do virtually anything to a farm animal. Not completely anything, as you know, because of investigations that people like TJ do. If you can document over and over and over and over and over again something that is incredibly cruel and abusive, you might be able to get a conviction. But for the most part, if enough farmers decide that it is economically expedient to chop off any part of an animal's body, with or without anesthetic, the way these laws work is that practice becomes legal by definition, and by definition is no longer cruel, which I think is exactly the same as if we were to let nursing home operators decide what constitutes elder abuse. It's something we would never do. We're letting the market decide what's cruel to animals. Now, I think you might have seen some of these in this morning's panel. I just want to go through these briefly because when we talk about customary farming exemptions, it's kind of an abstract concept, but what are we actually talking about? Well, top left, it's legal in any state in the country to chop off almost any part of an animal's body without anesthetic, including an ear, a beak, a tail, genitals. Genitals can also be crushed without anesthetic. Top middle, it's legal in most states to confine sows in gestation crates. Excuse me. In California, we have Prop 2, which theoretically outlaws this practice. California is not a big pork-producing state, so in more than 95% of the pork produced in the country today still comes from sows in gestation crates. Top right, it's legal in almost every state to raise hens in battery cages in which they'll spend most of their lives in an area about this big. Now, this is also theoretically made illegal by Prop 2, but again, about 95% of the eggs produced in the country still come from hens raised in battery cages. Now, you might say, well, that's terrible, but I get all my meat and all my eggs from organic farms, or I buy the cage-free, or I buy the humane. Well, let's look at the bottom three slides. On the bottom left, that is a cage-free hen facility. That is a facility that, for example, would be completely legal in California today because it would comply with Prop 2. These hens, about 100,000 of them in a dark windowless shed, will spend their lives in that shed. They'll be denied the ability to dust bathe, which is something that they love to do. They'll be debeaked typically, or subjected to partial beak amputation, as shown in the bottom right. This is a procedure that the research shows remains painful for the rest of the animal's life because it results in a fibrotic nerve ending. And for the rest of the animal's life, every time it eats, it will be in pain. And of course, bottom middle slide, male chicks are completely irrelevant to the egg production process. So they can be disposed of in any manner that is expedient. They can be thrown into wood chippers, meat grinders. They can be left to starve or freeze in garbage cans, et cetera. So the point is that we know that CAFOS are responsible for virtually all the meat, eggs, and dairy produced in this country. And I think we should assume that customary farming exemptions such as these are still going on in virtually all of the CAFOs in this country. So literally, all of the not literally, virtually all of the animal foods produced in this country come from animals that have been raised like this. Now, the very broad and aggressive legislative framework that we saw a few slides back gives animal food producers a very important economic benefit. It lets them offload the vast majority of their production costs onto consumers and taxpayers. If I take my garbage to the front of the curb and leave it there for the garbage service to pick up, and I pay them to pick it up, I internalize my garbage collection costs. In other words, I generate the garbage, I pay to pick it up, that's appropriate. On the other hand, if I drive over to a park and dump it there at midnight, I externalize my garbage collection costs. Most people think that's inappropriate. I argue that metaphorically speaking, animal food producers are dumping their garbage in our parks at midnight because, as this slide shows, they are imposing the vast majority of their production costs onto American consumers and taxpayers. And just to spend a little bit of time on these categories, that fish production figure, which is the smallest one, those are costs associated with bycatch, which is throwing away non-target animals, not only fish, but marine reptiles like turtles, dolphins, porpoises, birds. It's also the costs associated with overfishing and with damage to ecosystem caused by fish farming. A cruelty figure of about $20 billion, that's based on auction research that shows that Americans would likely be willing to spend collectively about $20 billion to end the worst of those customary farming practices that we saw in the previous slide. Environment figure of about $37 billion. Those are the costs related to animal food production associated with things like soil erosion, climate change mitigation, pollution of our rivers, lakes, and streams caused by those manure lagoons that Leslie showed us in her presentation. Subsidies, $38 billion. That's about that's the amount that state and federal governments pay to subsidize this industry. To put that figure in perspective, as a corporate welfare handout, that is about half of the amount that US states spend each year paying unemployment benefits to unemployed workers. And finally, that healthcare figure of $314 billion, those are mostly the costs associated with treating cancer, diabetes, and heart disease cases that are attributed, the clinical literature suggests are attributable to consuming animal foods. The entire universe of healthcare costs for those three diseases is about $1 trillion. So this is just a fraction that's related to animal food consumption. To put that total of $414 billion in perspective, it's about half of what Americans spend on Social Security every year. It's about a quarter of Canada's gross domestic product. So it is a large, large number. Another perspective on that number is to add it to the annual retail sales of animal foods. So each year, Americans spend about $251 billion. That's that yellow bar. Add the $414 billion from the prior slide of externalized costs, and you get the total of about $665 billion. That yields this interesting formula at the bottom, which is that for every $1 in animal foods sold at retail, another $1.70 approximately is imposed on consumers and taxpayers in the form of externalized costs. So, for example, whenever McDonald's sells a Big Mac for $5, another $8 in externalized costs is imposed on Americans. That means that a Big Mac doesn't really cost $5, it really costs $13. I suggest that because animal foods are not priced properly, that their prices seem low. And in fact, if we look at what prices have done in the last 80 years, roughly the time period that CAFOS emerged and became an important feature in animal agriculture, during that 80-year period, prices of animal foods have dropped across the board on an inflation-adjusted basis. Why? Because CAFOs are externalizing their costs, and that lets them lower their prices. Butter is down 44%, ham is down 48%, chicken is down 70%. Just to look at one example of how this actually works, this chart looks at the price of chicken compared to consumption over the same period. So you can see that in the top left, in 1935, chicken was about $5 a pound. Today it's about $1.50 a pound. In 1935, Americans ate about 9 pounds per person of chicken, and today Americans eat about 57 pounds of chicken per person. Just as the law of demand predicts, when prices go down, demand goes up, or consumption goes up. Now, the thing you can't see because of the way the components of the chart, if you could see just a 2-year breakdown for the 2012 to 2014 period, you would actually see that prices went up a little bit. That's because drought conditions in the West and Midwest caused an increase in the price of feed crops, soy and corn that are fed to chicken. As a result of that increase in feed crops and the resulting increase in the price of chicken, consumption actually came down a little bit in the last couple of years, just as the law of demand predicts. The point is, Americans' consumption of animal food products is driven heavily by price. And at the moment, those prices are massively, artificially low because of cost externalization. Let me quickly summarize to this point and then go on to talk about workers, rural communities, and small farmers. CAFOs externalize most of their costs. This keeps retail prices low. Low prices mean that consumers buy much more animal foods than they would otherwise, and that is why, it's one of the reasons why Americans have doubled their consumption of meat since 1935. The U.S. leads the world in per capita meat consumption, or is at least in the top 2 or 3, and also has among the world's highest rates of cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. Our huge level of consumption is causing problems in healthcare, in the environment, in the economy, and this level of consumption is simply not sustainable. Let's talk about the effect that CAFOs have on workers in rural communities. We've certainly seen some of this in Leslie's presentation. Among other things, CAFOs tend to employ fewer workers per animal than small farms do. So that means there's simply less employment when a CAFO comes in. They tend to purchase their supplies out of the area, so there's less economic activity in the local area. And these two features, less employment and less economic activity, lead to dramatic declines in local infrastructure. There are many rural communities in America today that are turning into ghost towns because CAFOs have entered and don't spend any money there. And of course, there's the massive problem with workplace injuries that Leslie talked about. CAFOs have much, much higher rates of worker injury than the national average. And there's incredible worker dissatisfaction. One New York Times article found that at a Smithfield pork plant that employed about 5,000 workers, there was 100% turnover every year. In other words, every single year, that plant hired 5,000 new workers because they just hate their jobs so much. How about small farmers? CAFOs operate at larger scale, so they're able to charge less for their products and survive on smaller margins than small farmers are. This tends to put small farmers out of business. According to the USDA, most small farmers in this country cannot sustain themselves financially from their farm and must take second jobs and in some cases third jobs. And that massive subsidy figure that we saw earlier doesn't typically make its way to the small farmers. It typically is paid to CAFOs. 90% of subsidy benefits hit only the top 20% of farmers in this country. That's CAFOs and like the next tier down, but it's not getting down to the small farmers. So we've come full circle. We're back to Aldous, who wrote Brave New World. He died in 1963, the year I was born. And I know what you're thinking. I don't look that old, but thank you. Somebody told me that maybe I'm his reincarnation, and I don't know. I can't confirm or deny that. I do want to leave you with a couple of quotes from Huxley. He was a real character. He had terminal throat cancer, and he died. He asked his wife to inject him with a massive dose of LSD when he was on his deathbed. This is before it was a controlled substance, so it was totally legal. But he died, presumably in a state of bliss. But he was a real character. He said, "Facts do not cease to exist simply because they are ignored." And he also said, "Maybe this planet is another planet's hell." During the roughly hour and a half that the three of us have been talking, about 2 million land animals have been killed for food in this country alone. And the fact of those animals' lives, the fact that they led lives characterized by those customary farming exemptions that we saw, they led lives of misery. Those facts don't go away because we choose to ignore them or we forget them or we deny them. Those facts are always there for those animals, for the next generation, and the next generation. Huxley tried to warn us that our government would endeavor to sell us goods that we don't want or need. And guess what? He was right. So I want to leave you with this thought. Let's think for ourselves. Let's not let our government tell us that beef is what's for dinner. Let's exercise our own independent decision-making. And if you're not already doing so, I strongly urge you to consider exercising the most powerful right that you have as a consumer, and that is to boycott this cruel, dysfunctional, and unsustainable industry. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Okay, great. Do we have any questions? Okay, you, sir.
I had a question. With the cage-free type of things where you said it's cage-free, but they're out there, can't you do deceptive advertising if you show like a picture on an egg carton that shows the happy chickens out in the sun, but they're really kept in the dark, and these, because we've had people, we do lawsuits, we do class actions, and people have approached us on that subject. If it's cage-free and they're out, not in cages, but kept in a big, building that's still cage-free, but if it shows a picture on the label of them outdoors in the sun, it sounds like it's deceptive advertising. Anybody done that, or?
Judy's egg case? Is it the Judy's egg case? Yeah. No.
Go ahead.
They have done that. There was it's called the Judy's egg case. It was ALDF was the lead plaintiff, and there was a picture on the carton of some free-ranging chickens and sunshine and whatever when all of their chickens were kept inside. So the case settled, and I believe you were involved. Public Justice involved? No. Oh, I thought that they were. But yeah, so there's been at least that case that I know of.
Then why not hit them every time they do that, a different company, since that's settled against one particular manufacturer? Why not just keep consistently filing class actions? Or with you, if you have stuff leaching into the groundwater from these CAFOS and everything, affecting the cities around them, why not do like when you do the perchlorate poisoning cases? Why not go class actions with the individual neighbors in the community and hit them that way, so it's not economically feasible to keep doing this?
So these are both great questions. You'll hear from one of the next panels about the environmental litigation that my group and Center for Food Safety and a bunch of other groups are doing. We're trying to use the federal environmental laws to go after the CAFOs for various types of pollution. And those are great cases. There's a couple of problems with them. One is that they're very, very expensive to bring. So it's a battle to get the cases up and running, but we're committed to doing more of that work, as much of that work as we can. The other, with regard to the Judy's eggs and the consumer cases, the Judy's Eggs case got a great result. They settled. The truth is that there are a lot of, legal barriers to consumer class actions, and the manufacturers will argue that it's technically true that that these are cage-free, and we're not trying to trick consumers. And just because we put a picture of a happy chicken on the label, that doesn't necessarily mislead consumers. And the truth is that if that case had actually gotten to court, it would have been, touch or go whether or not a court would have agreed with the plaintiffs. But in that case, ALDF was able to actually convince Judy's Eggs to voluntarily settle. But I do personally think that the more we can sue the bastards, the better.
Well, we do them if you want to talk.
Yes, ma'am.
I was interested in a statistic. Thanks. I can probably project, but I have a pet peeve actually in our movement, which someone defined nicely as the focus on minutia. And one of my real pet peeves is the amount of energy our movement puts into worrying about people who are concerned about happy meat. And so, David, something you said about the percentages, I've actually been looking for a percentage, and maybe you have it, as to how many animals, what percentage of animals are actually on CAFOS compared to farms that might be considered happy meat farms.
I don't know a percentage, but I do know that the terminology can be tricky, because typically even an animal that is raised in a pasture environment for the first part of its life, first part of his or her life, ends up going to a feedlot to be so-called finished. And a feedlot is a CAFO. So how would you determine whether that animal was the product of a factory farm or not? I would say that animal was the product of a factory. Even an organically raised animal starts its life on a pasture, goes to a feedlot, and then at the feedlot it's fed organic feed, but it's arguably still the product of a CAFO ultimately.
So do you have any idea as for numbers, the amount of animals, like Neiman Ranch and whatever, the happy meat people, what percentage of animals does that actually refer to?
I don't know the percentage, but again, even Neiman Ranch likely sends their animals to a feedlot to be finished. So even Neiman Ranch, arguably, no? I actually don't know, I'm speculating. But
they don't, but it's such a tiny percentage of,
okay, yeah,
so,
okay.
All right. I'll keep investigating them.
Yes, ma'am, we'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you so much to you three. What would you say to a generation of millennials who, from what I have observed, feel largely disempowered in opposing industry and having any influence against industry, considering how influential they are?
Well, I'm aware of a study in which members of Congress were asked, what influences your decision making? And at the top of the list was constituents who call or visit them. And it sounds just like a cliche, like, write your congressperson. But notwithstanding the amounts of money that they have to solicit to get reelected, and notwithstanding the importance of lobbying monies in their decision making, I think that they still place an enormous amount of importance on what their constituents are asking for. So I think it's really important to meet with our members of Congress and state legislatures.
Also, I'd just like to add, I was talking to Chris, who spoke earlier last night, and he was talking about how some very large percentage of, I can't remember what state it was, various states that you've looked at, you've had encouraging statistics that a lot of people are actually, against taking, creating exemptions for factory farmed animals from the anti-cruelty statutes. And what Chris was saying yesterday to me was that a lot of the impact in the younger generation, the millennials and so forth, is from being exposed to the type of undercover videos that TJ and his colleagues are responsible for. So one thing that you can just do is spread the word. The more people know and can see these images, the more people can understand what goes on, the more that they will be able to vote with their feet and not buy the stuff. Because I truly do believe that ultimately it's got to be, the impetus has got to come from consumers. People have to stop buying the stuff. And the more that consumers stop buying the stuff and start boycotting, the fast food corporations that utilize the pork that contains the ractopamine, et cetera, the more the large food chains and the large food producers will start insisting on different practices. So I would just say spreading the word, and I totally agree that also lobbying your legislatures is really important.
We had a question over here, Tom.
Hi. As a result of cancer, about a decade ago, I became a vegetarian, and then about 7 years ago, I became a vegan, and I feel a lot better. And I also discovered that how addicting meat was in my life on an emotional level and many different levels. But a couple months ago, on a flight back to LA, I saw a documentary about a stem cell, I don't know what you would call it, but they're taking stem cells from animals over in Amsterdam and some other places in that area, and they're reproducing meat without harming animals at all. And they expect to get this on the market in 2030. So I just wondered if you had heard about it and what effect that might have on all of this. I never heard of it before I saw the documentary, and it was very compelling. I wrote down a lot of notes on it. I don't have them with me, but.
Anyone?
No.
Well, were you here for Ethan Brown's presentation this morning?
I'm sorry, I was working this morning,
Oh.
and I didn't get here till later.
Well, I think lab cultured meat is certainly one option, and Ethan Brown, who is producing a different kind of plant-based meat, thinks that lab cultured meat may be a long way away from being ready for commercial production. But I would say whatever represents a solution, whatever represents an alternative to raising millions of animals in a factory farm is a good start.
Anyone else? Okay, right here.
Have OSHA laws been used in creative lawsuits against CAFOS?
Not that I know of. As I was saying earlier, OSHA's laws are pretty pathetic. As far as I know, that OSHA doesn't actually have any enforceable laws governing workplace standards in slaughterhouses and poultry processing plants. They merely have guidelines. So this is like the FDA stuff that Paige was talking about, how FDA refuses to actually take any action to ban or limit the use of antibiotics and CAFOS. It's the same thing with OSHA and with the USDA. They just won't take any action. They won't establish any meaningful standards. And as long as there are no meaningful standards, you can't sue directly. You can't sue a CAFO or a processing plant directly for violation of the law. The only thing you can do is sue the agency for failing to effectively carry out Congress's mandate. And the problem is we've got federal courts that are stacked with Reagan and Bush appointees, and it's very, very difficult to get a court to hold that an agency has either abused its discretion or acted contrary to law and failing to act out failing to pursue its statutory mandate. So I guess that's a really, really wordy way of saying difficult, but still worth thinking about. I'll never give up looking for ways, but it's tough.
Time for one more. Yeah.
So the Danish experiment I thought was really interesting. I can't remember who was talking about it there the most, but I never heard of that before. And I was wondering, how did they sell that? Or did it come from the government down or the people up? How did they sell that idea to change it, the farming like that?
Yeah. Well, it came from both. So the government actually listened to the consumers because there was a lot of consumer outcry about antibiotic-resistant infections, and they were having a lot of them in Denmark. But then it was the Danish government that went ahead and put the mandate through, and there was a little bit of resistance from the farmers because the pork producers didn't believe that it was possible, but they did it anyway, and once they realized that some small changes could actually enhance their productivity, for better or for worse, they went ahead and instituted the changes, and they were able to cut their antibiotic use in half. So, but it was a top-down approach after the government had reacted to the consumers and the medical community.
It was kind of a bottom-up approach. If the consumers started it,
Yep.
right? And then they responded.
Yeah.
So that's what we need, I think. How to do that.
Well, and I just wanted to add on too about the hope for the millennials. The exciting thing I think for all of us is that these conversations are taking place right now. We have panelists like Dave and Paige and Leslie and all of you all here, the future lawyers and the people at ALDF and other animal protection organizations that are doing great work. So I think it's a really exciting time, and let's give our panelists a big round of applause.
So we have a 15-minute break right now. We're back at 3, and I just wanted to point out to everyone in the event app that I think most of you have downloaded on your phones and tablets, there's a section for polls and feedback, and we do have a feedback for CLE participants in particular, and also a general feedback form. We'd appreciate if you could fill that out. We also have at the bottom of each panel session within the agenda session feedback. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. Thank you.